My name is David Park. I was born on December 19th, 1954. I was born in Prairie Grove, Arkansas at the Elizabeth Hospital.
And this interview is for the Prairie Grove Oral History Project, and we just want to be sure that we have your permission to reuse the interview.
You have my permission to reuse the interview.
Thank you, David. Who were your parents? Tell me about your parents.
My parents were Donald and Peggy Parks. Donald was born in Prairie Grove at their home, along with his twin brother Barry. And my mother was born in Fayetteville at the old city hospital building. She grew up in Fayetteville and my dad grew up in Prairie Grove.
Okay. Tell me about your family when you were growing up as a child. Did you have any siblings?
I was an only child, and so I didn't have any siblings. I had cousins nearby. My Uncle Barry, Dad's twin brother, had two daughters, Susan and Karen. And my Uncle Joe had a son and a daughter. The daughter was the oldest, Carol, and Jim was their son. I also had another uncle, James, who was the oldest of those four boys. And James and his wife, Janet, lived in California, and they had three children.
Tell me about your family business.
The family business is Prairie Grove Telephone Company, and it was incorporated in 1906. My great-grandfather, Dr. E.G. McCormick, was one of the owners. Also M.M. Collier, who is now of the Collier Drug Store family. The story goes, in 1888, we have got some pretty good written proof that it was that year that my great-grandfather, ran a line from his office, his doctor's office on Main Street, across to his brother's pharmacy. And that was the beginning of the communication side of the family business. And then from that point on, it began expanding somewhat, but it wasn't incorporated and actually became a business until 1906. But that's the story, and I bet I've told that 100 times to people about a family-owned telephone company, which typically people don't know about that.
Tell me more about the company, about how the succession over the years occurred, changes of management.
My great-grandfather, Dr. McCormick, being a doctor, that was his main occupation, but he was very involved in the growth of the area. And this, around the turn of the century, things were happening quickly. And so he was involved in the railroad coming through. He was involved in roads, building roads to Fayetteville, south to Van Buren and Fort Smith. He was involved in the canning factory in Prairie Grove. He was one of the charter members of First Presbyterian Church. All of that just around that turn of early 1900s, 1904, 5, 6. And then I think it was probably around 1911 or 12, I'm guessing, but his soon-to-be son-in-law, Jim Parks, started working for him as a operator, and then became the manager. So Jim, Dr. McCormick's son-in-law, ran the phone company for, worked there at least for like 50 years. So, and he died in 1958. So then, my dad, Donald, and my uncle, Barry, took on a larger role after my grandfather's death. And so then they ran the company and till basically the late 90s. I mean, they had less and less to do. They didn't really retire. Barry died in 2004. Donald died in 2006. So around the mid to late 90s, they were doing less and less. I started to work full-time in 1980. I had worked part-time back beginning summer of 1976. Worked summers, took a year and a half off from college to work, and worked a year and a half, and finished up college in December of '79, and then started full-time in 1980. And so then that's pretty much been the succession to date.
David, tell me about your jobs, your first jobs of working for the phone company. What were the kind of things you and your family members would do for the company?
I would start off doing, and this was probably maybe even in grade school, but junior high, I'd do odd jobs, sweeping and things like that. And then up into high school, I worked construction during the summers. And then after I was pretty much in school and worked summers up at Bella Vista for a couple of years until May of '76. And then I started working full-time. And some of my first jobs were splicing cable. We were putting in a lot of telephone cable to convert all our customers to private lines. And we still had quite a few party lines, which, they had their problems for sure. That people it seemed inevitable that somebody on the party line dominated the line. And then when somebody else needed to use it, they couldn't get somebody else off. So there were those kinds of problems. Plus the lines to the houses weren't in the best shape. They open wire, subject to a lot of wind and damage and lightning. So everything was being done buried. So that was one of my first jobs, to splice in some of this new buried cable. And then I would start going to people's houses and convert them over to a private line. And that was the most fun job, because everybody wanted off the party line. And so I would switch their wires around outside, and then I'd go to the door, because we had to switch the ringer out in the telephone, because they'd have a party line ringer that would only ring when somebody dialed their number. It wouldn't ring somebody else's number on the same line. So I said, well, I have to change out your ringer in your phone so I can convert you to private line. Well, my goodness, you'd think I was Santa Claus. I just was the bearer of good news. And they just invite me in, and they were so happy. And then, inevitably, they'd tell me a story about the party line being so hard to get on the phone. So I enjoyed that a lot. And then from that point on, moving into installation and repair and just some of that type of outside work.
Tell me some of the stories that they shared with you about the party lines.
Well, it was, again, not having the older technology was subject to problems. There would be the old iron wire. I mean, even a high wind would cross the wires and short out the line. So everybody on that line would go out. So there were a lot of issues like that were problems. But other than that, it was just someone dominating the line. Somebody just stayed on and talked to their mother or talked to relatives or friends, and wouldn't get off sometimes. So it was just, in general, it would be stories like that.
Let's talk about your family at home. What were some of the routines that you guys would do around the house and do at home? What were some of your, dinners and chores and stuff like that?
Well, at home, my mother taught fourth grade for 30 years. And so she was teaching that, during the school year. we didn't typically go on vacation very much. We might go to a telephone meeting in state. But my dad, Donald, was a very hard worker and just didn't feel like he could take time off. So he literally would work 6 to 7 days a week, at least part-time. Sundays he'd go to church, but could be either before or after he might be doing something at the office. And of course, if there were trouble tickets, people out of service, then that came first. And so a lot of life revolved around the family business, and there was a lot to do at that time with the telephones becoming more common. So the company was growing, say in the 60s and 70s, growing pretty fast. Back when my grandfather ran it, telephone service was more of a luxury, say back in the 20s, and then in the 30s, and during the Depression, people would disconnect just because they couldn't afford it. So they lost a lot of business then. But post World War II, the companies really started growing, and Donald and Barry would definitely they would do everything. They would from work on the central office to outside trouble to the books. I mean, they'd hire an accountant, a bookkeeper, but they were involved in all aspects of the business. So it was a full-time job.
You all were known for being one of the first or the first in the state to get rid of all those party lines or to switch over.
Right.
Let's talk, how were you able to do that in rural Prairie Grove, what maybe some of the city phone companies couldn't do?
We converted to all private lines in 1977, and we were the first telephone company, of which at the time there were probably 25 or 26 telephone companies in the state of Arkansas. The idea then was to be able to, one, to have better cable that would be less vulnerable to weather. And I'll just say this, the ice storm of 1949 made a big impression on Donald and Barry because it took down almost every line, literally, in this area. I think the story is maybe there were only 80 customers working out of, I don't know, about 2,000 or something, whatever the number was, but most everybody was out. And from that experience, they decided they needed cable underground, so the planning was started to do that, to get more reliable cable buried, and so while they're doing it, they would convert people to private lines. This wasn't necessarily a financially good decision. I mean, the consultants in the business said this won't work, but Donald Barry decided to do it anyway. And it did work, even financially. Less problems, happier customers. It all worked out well, and then other companies started converting over until, I don't remember the year, but it was many years later that the Public Service Commission in the state said everyone needs to be on a private line, and so. Then it was mandated that party lines were to be done away with. But that was probably, goodness, 12, 15 years later. I can't remember the date, but it was quite a while after we had already converted everyone over.
Let's talk about while we're on the subject of your dad and your uncle. Your dad was known for really wanting to make sure Prairie Grove was a neat, clean, friendly town. And he either himself would mow or he would have the staff go out and mow and clean up around town. And let's talk about that.
Well, Donald liked things neat. And so the grounds around the telephone company were neat, always mowed. And yeah, he would like to extend that out maybe to certain right-of-ways in the town or things like that. I mean, again, one of my first jobs was picking up litter. But he just hated messiness and litter. So we'd go out and pick up litter along the side of the road. And then I remember he felt like that the main street could look better because it had litter and dirty in his opinion. And the city didn't have a street sweeper, so he bought one. and all I can remember this, he would go down at least once a week. And I can't remember if I volunteered to help or if he just told me I was going to help. But we'd get up at 4 o'clock on a Sunday morning and go down there. And the reason I now remember, the reason I wanted to is because I got to drive the street sweeper. It was one of those that was you sit on, big street sweeper. And so I got to drive that, and then he would run the broom and the pan and pick up the bigger pieces and or pick up leftover from what I didn't get with the street sweeper. But we did that, my gosh, several Sunday mornings. I remember one time he came in to wake me up and I said, "Dad, I just can't, I'm too tired." And so he went down by himself and swept the streets. But I mean, of course, at that time, very little traffic. Every now and then a car might come by, but of course it was very low traffic. So yeah, that was very important to Donald. Very important. Well, need to look neat.
The other thing is they were always ones to help with funding or projects, but not really want the credit for it or a lot of publicity. And talk about that philosophy. I think they would look at a project or a need, and the idea was to fulfill the need. And if they can help, or if they could get somebody else to, that's what was important. Is that this need be met, or this issue be helped or improved, and the credit was just not important. In fact, I think it was even embarrassing. They really just didn't feel like that it probably was deserved, but that's not what they were in it for. And I think too, and I feel this way, that this family, because of Dr. McCormick's beginning, which at the time wasn't much, it grew into a very good business, but for decades it wasn't profitable. It really wasn't much. But the fact that it did become profitable, and it was a very good business, I felt like we were handed a very generous gift, and therefore felt like it was a responsibility to pass on some of that generosity. What are your earliest memories of Prairie Grove?
I can remember when my grandfather died. That's probably the earliest memory that I have in my life, and because it was a shock. It wasn't expected. He had a stroke. It was on Sunday morning, Palm Sunday, and my grandmother called the house. It was maybe 5:30 or 6 in the morning. And Dad answered and said, "Something's wrong with Jim." And so both my mom and Dad rush up there. We lived just on the other end of the block from my grandmother and granddad. I'm asleep. I felt like I'd be fine. So, but I woke up. And I don't know, I had this sense that something wasn't right. So I climb out of I don't think I was in a crib. I was probably 3. But anyway, climb out, and nobody's there. And so I go next door to the neighbors. And it's Fred and Jessie Carlisle, and they're an older couple. And of course, they were part of my family basically. And I'd always just walk in. Well, this morning they had happened to lock the door, so I couldn't get in. And so I ran up to grandmother's house, across the yard, and I can still remember my my pajamas, because they had the feet in them, you know, like little kids would wear, and had kind of the harder surface, you know, in the feet. And I can still remember the sound that made as I ran in the grass and ran up to the back porch at grandmother's, and I probably made some noise. Well, anyway, my mother met me there, and I remember her saying, "What are you doing here?" So, and then I can remember looking in at the bedroom, and Dr. Frank Rigal was bending over my granddad, but he was already gone. But that's my earliest memory of Prairie Grove. Other than that, you know, childhood memories of playing in the backyard. Kerwin Dees, Ricky Skelton, Phil Cole, Mike Shoemaker, all were in that neighborhood. We had a pretty good number of kids that were in the neighborhood that play basketball, football, play Army, whatever it might be. But it was just, I don't know, your ideal, typical growing up place.
Tell me a little bit about your mom. I know she was really a good teacher and touched a lot of kids, and I think she was involved with the starting of the square dancing. So kind of tell me some of the impact she made in the community.
She, it's a neat story, because she said she never set out to teach. Really never occurred to her. But it was shortly after I was born. I was still pretty young, maybe 2 or 3. But there was a teacher that had quit, I think, at Prairie Grove, 4th grade, and Ray Cornwell, who was the superintendent, needed somebody to teach. And at that time, this was probably mid-50s, let's see, I know her first class was 1957, 58, but she may have taught, finished up a year when Ray Cornwell called. Anyway, she went and finished up that class, and she immediately knew this was it. This was her calling. So teaching found her, and from that point on, she taught. But and at the time she could, but she needed to get her degree, and she didn't have her teaching degree, college degree. So she went back to school and had during the summers and finished up, and it was probably late 59 maybe that she finished, but she sent out a little announcement that stated that she was graduating, and with a Bachelor of Science in Education. And then at the bottom, because it was sent out by me, at the bottom it said, if you think it's tough sending your kids to college, just try sending your mother.
Let's talk about the square dancing. How did that happen?
The square dancing was part of her teaching, and she was teaching on the Civil War and the Battle of Prairie Grove, and she actually wrote a play, a little skit on the battle. Had General Hindman and the General Herron and Blunt, and they went through the battle. But in that, there was a dance of the era, and the Virginia Reel, I believe the name of it. So she took it on herself to teach the kids that dance. And then I believe they did a little demonstration at the Battlefield Park during the Labor Day celebration of this dance. And at that time, some of the women would dress up in the clothes of that period of the 1860s. But that started the whole square dance. So then other groups would start. It just built up to the point that it's a big deal now. Many square dance groups. But she started it not to start maybe an annual square dance event, but just as a demonstration of the time, and especially in Prairie Grove, with the Battle of Prairie Grove.
Tell me about going to school in Prairie Grove.
Well, I started in first grade in 1961. Miss Carl was my first grade teacher, and we were in the old building. It was across from the Presbyterian Church. It was angled catty corner from the Presbyterian Church. And then across the street there was the big 3-story school building. And that was where my dad and my uncle even went to school. So it was an old building. But and that's where my mother taught. So I went first grade and second grade in it was first, second, and third in this one building. That was the last 2 years. And then my third grade, we built a new school building, elementary school building. Basically the one that has just been torn down, but it was up the northern part of town. And well, at the time, that was a show place. That was nice. So 3rd through 6th was there, and then 7th grade was at the high school. So we had 7th graders mixed in with seniors, and you can imagine sometimes how sometimes 11th and 12th graders like to pick on 7th graders. So I had my books knocked out of my hand a few times, and and I tried not. And when I got to be that age, I tried not to do that, certainly. And it was. We played in the old Phillips Gymnasium, which I think a year after I graduated, it burned. But I was very involved in sports, and basketball was a big part of what I did, football, and track. And didn't really have a baseball team, had summer baseball, which I played, Pee Wee, Little League, Babe Ruth. But that was the main sports and the main activities.
Who were some of the teachers you remember that made the most impression on you?
Well, I can definitely remember Miss Carl being the first grade teacher. And she was an older lady at the time. She had taught for decades, I think, even when I was in her class. Then Miss Phillips was 2nd grade, and it was her first year, and she had over 40 students, huge class, you know. I think it almost overwhelmed her, but she did great. You know, it's hard to say a favorite teacher. I really, you know, going on into 3rd grade with Mrs. Underwood, and 4th grade I didn't have my mom, and so fortunately or unfortunately, had Miss Story. Miss Tyree was a great teacher in 5th grade. I loved her. Mrs. Hilton, and in the 6th, and then in junior high and high school, you know, like Barbara Ireland, Stella Cash, 2 of my all-time favorites. Loved them. So I had a lot of really good teachers. And I hate to put, one above any of them because they really were all very good.
What are some of the stores and businesses you remember during the 60s, 70s, and 80s of trading with?
Dyer's Cafe probably was the most memorable. Irene Dyer and Tom Dyer. Irene ran the cafe, and then Tom had a welding shop next to the cafe. And I mean, that was a place to eat. And that was something about Prairie Grove. It seemed we always had a need met, whether it was a place to eat out, a good plumber, there was always something there, the hospital, Dr. Frank Rigall, Dr. Manning. I mean, it was a very self-sufficient, at the time, very self-sufficient community. But Dyer's Cafe, my goodness, there would be people that would come from outside Prairie Grove area just to eat there because it was so good. So that was certainly an early memory, and I can remember the Labor Day celebration and the Lions Club putting that on, and there for a few years I was in charge of flags, and I would go and pick. We had little American flags, and they were stored in the ladder barn, and so at least once a year I'd go up in the attic there, get them all out at the beginning of Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, and stick them in those pillars along the rock wall in the park. And there were little pillars with little flag holes. So I'd put the American flag, next one I'd put a Confederate flag, and so forth, alternate. And then where the big pillars were, there would be a big American flag and a big Confederate flag. So there were flags flying, all around the circle there at the park on those 3 days. And then at the end of the day, at sunset, I'd go back and I'd pick them up and take them in, put them in the attic, and then do the same thing the next day. So that was fun. I enjoyed that part. But that's, memories of course, the phone company was, the biggest memory for me, just going down there and talking to the ladies that worked there or the guys that worked outside, and just Main Street being, the Crescent and the Eat Shop. I remember that. Remember when the water tower fell? That was there. It was being taken down, but the guy didn't quite measure it right, and it fell on the Crescent department store. So that was big news. That was. I was older then. I was probably, late 20s maybe, early 30s. But memories of church. I was a very regular attendee at Sunday school, the Presbyterian Church, so that was a big part of our lives. Both my mother and my father were Presbyterians, and so we were very involved in the local church here. Yeah. So I even had a 6-year perfect attendance pin for Sunday school.
When you were a kid growing up in Prairie Grove, what would you and your friends do for fun?
Well, we would, a lot of it is related to sports. We had an old basketball goal in the backyard. It was actually my friend Kerwin Dees had built, and I don't know who exactly, my dad might have been involved because it was a telephone pole with a wood backboard and a rim that was just set up in the field. It was a vacant lot, basically. And so a lot of games there. We'd play football out in the field between my house and my grandmother's. It was all open. We would baseball, play that. So sports was mostly what we'd do. We'd also we'd play Army, where we'd be fighting the Germans or whoever. Some of the shows on the time, at that time, like Combat, were based on World War II type stories, and that was kind of a big deal in the 60s. So we do that'd be part of our playtime.
What did your parents and their friends do for fun when you were a kid?
Well, Mother had a bridge club for a while that she would be involved in and host. You know, like I said, Dad, I mean, they would, Dad played tennis. That was his main sport. He played golf, just he never was very good. My Uncle Barry played golf more and didn't play as much tennis. So Dad was more the tennis player, Barry was more the golfer. I would join them, you know, in those games. Play golf with Barry and tennis with Dad. But like I said, we never really traveled much, so stayed at home, just mowing. Mowing was a big deal. I'd mow my grandmother's yard, and I'd mow Fred and Jesse's yard, our yard. And Dad couldn't even help himself. He'd have to come out and help because he wanted me to do it, learn a responsibility, but then he loved to mow. So that was another spare time activity.
What do you remember? You talked some earlier about the Battlefield Park. What do you remember kind of over the years how it went from one pavilion to this big complex now?
Well, you know, I mean, my memories of the park are not too much different than the way they are now. A lot of those buildings were already there. They were in the 50s, you know. I think the community got behind cleaning it up. It was always been an area that, like my grandmother was involved in a group just to preserve that. And this was long before it became a state park. But my dad and uncle would tell me they'd have reunions. I mean, back when, say in the 20s, when they were old enough to, they were born in 1919, so say mid to late 20s, they would remember having Confederate reunions, and they would bring Confederate soldiers to the park, or they'd come visit, and they, of course they were old at the, you know, during those reunions, but they'd actually have people that were in the war that would come to the park. But so much of that was done in the 50s, really before my time. So the Latta Barn, the house, the Latta House, the, you know, of course, so much of that was, I mean, some of that was already, Borden House was already there, just needed to be repaired a little bit. But the Square Dance Pavilion was one thing that was added that I remember, and the caretaker's house. But I mean, that park is, in my memory, has been pretty much how it is today. It's been a big part of Prairie Grove, and I think it's one of our greatest assets.
Let's talk more about the park. I know that you and a group of other local people got behind as a group of the Friends of the Park whenever there was a lot of opposition to expansion, and kind of that helped spur the state to say, hey, there actually is some local support. We can go forward to this.
Well, Ed Smith called me probably early 90s, 1992 or 3, and at the time there was some land available north of the park, and he felt like having an association, a Friends of Prairie Grove Battlefield Park, would help in showing local support, showing that we were behind some expansion. And so we formed this, and we were able to raise $100,000 towards the purchase because the state didn't have enough money to buy this land. I think it was the land of Bun and Louise Bell, and so they were selling some. So then it became a little more of a controversial issue because there was a list of endangered battlefields, Civil War battlefields across the country, and Prairie Grove was on the list, maybe third, you know. So that got more attention, and that got more attention to purchasing land and expanding, and there were some that were against that. There were some that were for it. It was a bit of an issue there for a few years, but I'd say to Ed Smith's credit, to the credit of the state parks department, they were patient and waited, and as time went on, and just being patient, I think, from the state and the parks department paid off, and they were able to preserve and purchase more land. The area north of the park, sort of the main part, and you look over, they called it the view shed, and as you look out, I mean, that's where the battle was, and they just felt it was very important to preserve that, and it is now. So, you know, sometimes it's not easy to get to a point of what really should be, but it got there, and so it's the view shed is preserved. It's I think it's in good shape now, and you know, it's so much better to be able to be in the park and to be able to look to the north and envision the General Herron's army coming up towards the hill, and how so much of that battle was as they came up that hill, and the Confederates driving them back down, you know, towards the Illinois River, and then to the west, General Blunt's army coming in the afternoon, basically to save the day for the Federal Army, and so all of that being preserved, I think, was very important, and I'm glad it's the way it is now.
Now, what other stories about Prairie Grove can you think of, maybe that I haven't asked about?
Well, other stories. Give me a minute.
Okay, let me ask you this.
Okay.
If somebody came to you and said, David, tell me, what is your hometown of Prairie Grove like? What would you tell them in a kind of a short summary, what your town of Prairie Grove is like?
Well, I'd say growing up here, what I think noticed was it's an old town, at least old in the sense of this area. It had, been around since the late 1800s. A lot of older houses. It's a pretty town, and a lot of it being the fact that it's in the setting that it is, being up above the Illinois River, having the view that's there, the way it's set up, and it's a small town. It certainly was a small town growing up, and it's not as much of a small town now, growing rather fast as the area is. It's a warm community. I feel like that we come together when there is a need. I think we take care of each other. It's a loving town. It's close-knit. A lot of people grew up here and still live here. It's not the kind of town that people would grow up and say, I can't wait to get out of here, or there's no opportunities. Credit should go to this whole Northwest Arkansas region too, as far as the growth and the business and opportunities. But Prairie Grove is just a great place to live, and it's close to the Fayetteville, Springdale, Rogers, Bentonville, and all of the activities that provides. University of Arkansas